The combine died on a Tuesday. Not slowly, not with warning. It just stopped right there in the middle of a half-harvested cornfield in Audrain County, Missouri in the dry, cracked autumn of 1983. And the man behind the wheel, a lean, sun-weathered farmer named Dale Emmett Krug, 61 years old with hands that looked like old fence posts, he didn't curse, didn't kick the door. He just sat there for a long moment, staring out through a dust-filmed windshield at 800 acres of corn he wasn't sure he could afford to finish harvesting. Then he climbed down from that machine, an old John Deere 6600, the kind that had already been patched together so many times the parts didn't know their own origin, and he looked at the soil beneath his boots. And what he saw in that soil was the beginning of everything. Let me tell you about Audrain County, Missouri, in 1983. Sit with that for a moment. 1983. The farm crisis that would eventually swallow a quarter of American family farms was already breathing down the neck of the Midwest. Interest rates had climbed so high in the early Reagan years that borrowing money to plant a crop felt like a slow form of self-destruction. The USDA was reporting topsoil losses that should have made the nation weep. Some estimates put annual soil erosion at 4 billion tons across American farmland. 4 billion tons. And in northeastern Missouri, where the rolling prairies met the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest, and the land tilted just enough to make every heavy rain a small catastrophe, farmers were watching their best earth slide down into creek beds and disappear. Audrain County sat in the middle of all this like a man caught between two storms. It was corn and soybean country, flat to gently rolling, black-soiled and historically generous. But generosity has limits. And by 1983, after a generation of aggressive tillage and chemical dependency, some of that generous topsoil was only 6 inches deep where it had once been 18. The fields smelled different than they used to. Old-timers would tell you that. The deep, rich, almost sweet smell of healthy Missouri bottomland had been replaced by something thinner, more metallic, like earth that was tired. The nearest town of consequence was Mexico, Missouri. Not the country, the town, population about 12,000, home to a Walmart that had recently put 3 local hardware stores out of business and a farm bureau office where men sat in bad chairs and talked about loan extensions with faces that had forgotten how to look hopeful. This is where Dale Krug had farmed for 32 years, where his father farmed before him, where, if things kept going the way they were going in 1983, nobody in the Krug family would be farming for much longer. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known a person who was deeply, quietly certain about things, not arrogant, not loud about it, just certain in a way that made you want to lean in and listen? Dale Krug was that kind of man. He was born in 1922, the second son of Heinrich and Marta Krug, German immigrant farmers who had come to Audrain County in 1908 with $40, a milk cow, and an absolute refusal to be beaten by anything. Dale grew up during the Dust Bowl, which means he grew up understanding at a cellular level what happens when you stop respecting the land. He remembered being 9 years old and watching his father kneel in a field, pick up a handful of dirt and smell it, actually press it to his nose and breathe it in the way another man might smell bread from an oven. Guts, his mother had asked from the porch. His father had shaken his head slowly. Nicht genug Leben, not enough life. Not enough life. Dale Krug carried those 3 words for 50 years. He'd served in the Pacific Theater during World War II, come home in 1946 with a Purple Heart and a quiet that his wife Ruth Ann née Hollenbeck from Callaway County, practical as a fence post and twice as strong, understood without needing it explained. They married in 1947, bought 240 acres from a neighbor who was giving up. Built that to 800 acres over the next 20 years through a combination of careful purchasing, hard work, and a discipline with money that bordered on the monastic. By 1983, Dale Krug was the kind of farmer other farmers respected but didn't always listen to, because he was slow and considered and didn't chase every new chemical or every new piece of equipment the way the younger men did. His operation was modest by the standards of the era. He drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it. He wore the same Carhartt jacket for 11 years. He kept notebooks, actual composition notebooks, the black and white marbled kind in which he recorded soil observations going back to 1951, rainfall, earthworm counts, crop yields, observations that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to him. He was, in the language of his county, old-fashioned, which is what people say about a man when they've decided to stop hearing him. Now every story has its other side. About 4 miles east of Dale Krug's property, along Route C where it crossed the old rail spur, there was a farm operation that looked like a different century altogether. Gleaming green machinery. Grain bins that could be seen from the highway. A name on the mailbox, Gerald family FARMS, that carried a particular weight in Audrain County, because Gerald Whitmore carried a particular weight. Gerald was 44 years old in 1983, which made him young in farmer years, young enough to believe that he had invented farming, more or less. He had inherited 1,200 acres from his father, borrowed against them to buy another 800, and was in the process of leasing several hundred more. He drove a brand new John Deere 4640, a machine that cost in the neighborhood of $80,000, and he kept it so clean it looked like it had never touched a field. He was a big man, not fat but big, the kind of physical presence that filled a doorway. He wore clean Wranglers. He had a belt buckle the size of a saucer. Gerald Whitmore was not, by any honest measure, stupid. He understood yield per acre. He understood operating margins and grain futures and the mathematics of scale. He ran his operation with what he called modern precision, which in practice meant maximum chemical inputs, deep fall tillage with a DMI 500 series chisel plow, and an absolute conviction that old ways were old ways because they didn't work as well. But there was something in Gerald Whitmore that had curdled somewhere, a contempt for what he couldn't quantify, a dismissiveness toward the men who farmed by feel and observation, and the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit in a spreadsheet. He had a way of listening to an older farmer talk that wasn't really listening at all, more like waiting for the person to finish so he could correct them. He served on the County Farm Bureau Board. He had the ear of the Mexico, Missouri branch manager at Boone County National Bank, a man named Clyde Abernethy, who Gerald referred to as Clyde, and who referred to Gerald as our most valued agricultural account. In the fall of 1983, Gerald Whitmore was the loudest voice in Audrain County, telling anyone who would listen that the future of Missouri farming was more chemistry, more horsepower, more tillage, that the men who hadn't caught up were simply going to get left behind. He was not entirely unkind about it. He just said it the way a person says something they consider so obviously true it barely needs saying. And he had a particular way of smiling when Dale Krug's name came up in conversation. The confrontation happened, as so many important confrontations do, at a meeting nobody thought would matter. It was the third Tuesday of November 1983. The Audrain County Extension Office held its annual Fall Soil Management Seminar in the basement of the Mexico First Methodist Church, which smelled of old hymnals and industrial coffee, and the particular nervous tension of men who are in trouble and don't want to admit it. Roughly 40 farmers showed up that night. The speaker was a University of Missouri Extension agent named Harold Beck, a decent, careful man who spent most of his presentation talking about erosion numbers and yield data and the rising cost of nitrogen fertilizer. Dale Krug sat in the third row. He had driven 17 miles in a truck with a heater that worked on its left side only, wearing his Carhartt jacket. He had his composition notebook in his lap. Gerald Whitmore arrived 15 minutes late and sat near the back. He had driven 4 miles in a truck with heated leather seats. The trouble started during the question period. Harold Beck had just finished presenting data showing that average topsoil depth in northeastern Missouri had decreased by approximately 4 inches since 1950, a figure that should have stopped the room cold. A few men shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. And Dale Krug raised his hand. "Mr. Beck," he said in that deliberate way he had, the words coming out slow and curt, "my father measured the topsoil on my ground in 1951, 18.5 inches in my north field. I measured it last spring, 14 inches. He paused. "At the rate we're losing it, some of us have maybe 2 generations left before that ground won't grow a decent corn crop without more chemical intervention than anybody can afford." The room was quiet for a moment. Then from the back came Gerald Whitmore's voice. "Dale," he said, and there was a patience in his tone, the patience of a man explaining something to a child, with respect. "That's not how this works anymore. We have inputs now. We have precision application. Every pound of nitrogen we're losing, we can replace. You're thinking like 1951. "I'm thinking," Dale said quietly, "like my topsoil." A few men chuckled, not unkindly mostly. Gerald pressed forward. "I'll tell you what I know, Dale. I averaged 142 bushels of corn per acre this year. What you average?" The room went a little more quiet. 119, Dale said. Gerald Whitmore nodded slowly, like a judge. "That's 23 bushels the difference. At let's say $3.20 a bushel, that's $70-some an acre. You've got 800 acres. You're leaving $50,000 on the table every year farming the old way." He said it without malice. That was almost the worst part. He said it like a math problem being solved on a chalkboard. "You're also spending about $40 an acre more than me in inputs," Dale said. "And I'm making it back, and then some." Dale Krug looked at him for a long moment. "Are you accounting for what's leaving your field every time it rains?" Gerald Whitmore smiled. "That's what the fertilizer's for." The meeting ended a little while later. Men filed out into the cold November night, breath making small clouds in the Missouri air. Gerald Whitmore stood near the door talking to Clyde Abernethy from the bank, laughing at something. Dale Krug walked to his truck alone, opened his composition notebook under the dome light, and wrote 3 words. "This ends differently. Let me pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters. What do you do when you understand something important, something that you can feel in your bones is true, but you can't prove it yet in a language that other people speak? What do you do when the evidence is in your notebooks, in your topsoil measurements, and in the memory of your father pressing good dark earth to his nose and saying not enough life, but the evidence isn't in a yield report or a bank statement? You do what Dale Krug did, you keep working, and you pay attention." Because here is what Dale Krug knew in 1983 that almost nobody in Audrain County was talking about yet. He knew about earthworms. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Dale had been counting earthworms in his field since 1959. Seriously, he kept a protocol. He would take a 12-inch by 12-inch square sample, dig down 12 inches, and count every earthworm. He did this in multiple locations across his various fields in spring and fall. He had recorded those numbers in his composition notebooks for 24 years. And what those numbers told him was a story that the university hadn't fully caught up to yet, but that a small number of soil scientists, researchers like Dr. W.C. Moldenhauer at the National Soil Erosion Research Laboratory in West Lafayette, Indiana, were beginning to publish about in agricultural journals that nobody at the Audrain County Extension Office had made it to yet. The story was this: healthy soil is not primarily a chemical system. It is a biological system, and the biology, the bacteria, the fungi, the microarthropods, and yes, the earthworms is what makes the chemistry work. Destroy the biology through excessive tillage and heavy pesticide application, and you create a dependency. The soil stops being capable of feeding itself. It becomes, in the language a farmer might use, addicted to inputs. You need more nitrogen every year, not because nitrogen is disappearing, but because the biological machinery that cycles nitrogen naturally has been dismantled. Dale had watched this happen on his own ground in the early 1970s, when he'd gone along with the prevailing wisdom and increased his chemical nitrogen applications and his fall tillage depth. His earthworm counts had dropped by roughly 60% over 5 years. His yield went up short-term. His soil, he could feel it, could see it, began to change texture. It compacted more easily. It shed water instead of absorbing it. After a heavy rain, his north field, which ran slightly toward the creek, would develop rills, small channels where water was carrying soil off the field that weren't there in his father's time. He stopped the deep fall tillage in 1978, just stopped, cold. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Gerald Whitmore, who was already becoming the dominant voice of modernization in the county, had driven by Dale's fields in spring of 1979, seen the unworked surface residue, and stopped his truck to ask if everything was all right. Dale had told him everything was fine. But he'd also been reading in a way that embarrassed some people, reading soil science journals, subscribing to a newsletter called The New Farm put out by the Rodale Institute in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, which was by 1979 one of the few publications in America that was taking seriously what it called regenerative farming. He'd driven to Columbia to attend a University of Missouri soil science lecture in 1980, sitting in a hall full of graduate students 30 years younger than him, taking notes in his composition book. And he had started very quietly experimenting. He planted winter cover crops, cereal rye and hairy vetch, on his north field in 1979. He inoculated his soybean seed with rhizobium bacteria cultures, the way his father had, rather than relying entirely on synthetic nitrogen. He used a case 900 chisel plow set shallow, 4 inches, rather than the 8 to 10 inch depth that was standard. He watched his earthworm counts. By 1983, after 5 years of this, his Northfield earthworm counts were back to where they'd been in 1965. His topsoil, which had been losing roughly a quarter inch per year, had stabilized. More than stabilized, in 2 of his Northfield quadrants, he was seeing organic matter percentages that had actually increased slightly for the first time in a generation. His yields were lower than Gerald Whitmore's, he couldn't argue with that. But his input costs were also lower, his soil was deeper, and he was sitting on something, he could feel it, that was about to become more important than anybody understood. The drought of 1983 was about to make it obvious. The summer of 1983 in Missouri was cruel. It started dry in April. By June, the National Weather Service was reporting precipitation deficits across the entire Corn Belt. The word drought was being used carefully at first, then freely. By late July, corn that should have been knee-high was chest-high but water-stressed, leaves curling at the edges, the characteristic sign of a plant fighting its own evaporation. In Audrain County, the county extension office reported that some fields were already showing yield loss potential of 20 to 40%. And then came the August rain. After 2 months of almost nothing, it came hard. Not a gentle soaking rain, but the kind that comes with thunder and anger, 3 inches in 4 hours on the night of August 11, 1983. Dale Krug lay awake in his farmhouse on Route C listening to it hammer the metal roof, and what he felt was not dread. Gerald Whitmore lay awake in his farmhouse 4 miles east and felt something closer to dread, though he wouldn't have named it that. The difference in the morning light was written in the soil. Dale's fields, the Northfield especially, the one he'd been nursing back to biological health since 1979, had absorbed that rain. Not all of it, no. But the surface, covered in rye residue from the previous winter's cover crop with its network of earthworm tunnels and root channels and aggregated structure, had absorbed enough that the runoff was minimal. There were no rills. The surface looked dark and damp and intact. Gerald Whitmore's fields, fall chisel plowed to 8 inches, bare surface, biological structure disrupted, had not absorbed the rain so much as been assaulted by it. 3 of his fields showed significant rill erosion. His south field, which ran toward a county drainage ditch, had deposited a visible sediment fan at the field's edge. And in the low spots where the compaction was worst, the water had pooled and sat, drowning what corn roots were left in already stressed plants. Word spread the way word spreads in a farming community, through morning coffee at Mick's Diner on Washington Street in Mexico, through the extension office waiting room, through the grain elevator conversation lines. People had driven by the Krug fields. People had driven by the Whitmore fields. By mid-September, when harvest was beginning, the numbers started to become clear. Gerald Whitmore's corn averaged 89 bushels per acre on his worst fields. His best came in at 118. His county average, the 142 he had cited at the November meeting, was a memory from another year. Dale Krug's corn averaged 107 bushels per acre, across his 800 acres. Now let me be precise about this, because precision matters here. Dale didn't beat Gerald Whitmore's yield that year. What he did was something more important. In the long run, his yields held. While Whitmore's operation had swung wildly, boomed in the good years, crashed in the hard one, Dale's operation had absorbed the drought and the flooding rain and come out the other side with crops that were, if not spectacular, viable. And then came the numbers that really told the story. Dale Krug's input cost per acre in 1983 was $87. This included his seed, his limited herbicide application, his shallow tillage passes, his cover crop seed. Gerald Whitmore's input cost per acre in 1983 was $141. This included his seed, his full chemical program, nitrogen, phosphorus, herbicides, insecticides, his deep tillage. At $3.10 per bushel for corn in the fall of 1983. Dale Krug grossed roughly $264 per acre and netted $177. Gerald Whitmore grossed roughly $276 per acre on his best ground and netted $135. On his worst ground, the eroded, waterlogged fields, Gerald netted less than $60 per acre after inputs. Across 2,000 acres, the math was devastating. But there was one more thing, one thing that I want you to pay attention to, because it's the detail that has stayed with everyone who was there. In October of 1983, a USDA Soil Conservation Service agent named Raymond Pfeiffer drove out to Audrain County to do erosion assessments following the August event. He visited Gerald Whitmore's operation first. The appointment had been scheduled. He measured the real erosion, estimated the soil loss, filled out his forms. He walked the fields with a professional detachment that, to his credit, he couldn't entirely maintain. Then he drove 4 miles west and visited Dale Krug's fields unannounced. He'd heard about them from the extension office. He stood in Dale's north field for a long time. He knelt and dug up a handful of soil and looked at it, looked at the structure of it, the aggregation, the dark, rich color that indicated organic matter, the way it held together rather than crumbling to powder. He looked up at Dale, who was standing nearby in his Carhartt jacket. "How long have you been doing this?" Pfeiffer asked. "Doing what?" Dale said. Pfeiffer looked back down at the soil in his hand, not destroying it. The County Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1983, almost exactly a year after the confrontation in the Methodist church basement, was a different kind of room. The same folding chairs, the same industrial coffee, the same 40-some farmers, Harold Beck from the extension office, Gerald Whitmore near the back, though he arrived on time this year. Raymond Pfeiffer from the USDA stood up and presented his findings from the post-August erosion assessment. He used a slide projector, the clicking kind with the carousel, and the images told the story more clearly than any words. Fields with deep tillage and bare surfaces, rill erosion, sediment loss, pooling damage. Fields with cover crop residue and shallow tillage, absorption, structure, integrity. He named no names in his presentation. He didn't have to. When he was done, the room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Gerald Whitmore did not say anything. He sat in the back with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face was one that men who were there that night have described in different ways over the years. Thoughtful, some said; tight, said others. One man, a farmer named Arnie Detmer, told his son many years later that Gerald Whitmore in that moment looked like a man who had just realized he'd been arguing with the weather. Dale Krug didn't say anything either. He sat in the third row with his composition notebook in his lap and didn't look around the room. He didn't need to. Harold Beck asked if there were questions. A few men asked Pfeiffer about cover crop costs, about residue management, about whether the university had recommendations yet on biologicals. The questions were different from a year ago, less defensive, more genuinely curious. The kind of questions you ask when you're ready to actually learn something. One man, a younger farmer named Tom Cassidy, who farmed 400 acres south of Mexico, asked Dale Krug directly, "Would you be willing to let some of us come out and walk your fields?" Dale looked up. He didn't pause long. "Come any time," he said. That was all. No speech, no satisfaction, just come any time. In the spring of 1984, 11 farmers from Audrain County walked Dale Krug's fields on a Tuesday morning in March, when the ground was just starting to soften and the overwintered cereal rye was showing green through the frost-gray residue. Dale walked with them. He talked about what he'd done and why. He showed them his composition notebooks, the earthworm counts, the topsoil measurements, the yield records going back 30 years. He explained the rhizobium inoculation of his soybean seed. He showed them how he set the depth on his case 900 chisel plow. He was 62 years old and had never been a teacher in his life, and he was one of the most effective teachers any of those 11 farmers had ever encountered. By 1985, 7 of those 11 farmers had planted winter cover crops on at least some of their acres. 4 had reduced their fall tillage depth. 3 had begun keeping their own soil notebooks. By 1988, the University of Missouri Extension Service, partly in response to the documented results coming from Audrain County and similar counties across the Midwest, had developed a formal cover crop management guide for Missouri corn and soybean producers. Dale Krug is not credited in that publication. His name appears nowhere in it. But Raymond Pfeiffer, who by then was with the Missouri Department of Agriculture, told an interviewer years later that the fieldwork he'd done in Audrain County in 1983 was among the most formative experiences of his professional career. Gerald Whitmore did not change overnight. That would make a neater story, but it wouldn't be true. He continued his operation largely as before through 1985 and 1986. In 1987, facing the tightening vice of the farm crisis, which by then had claimed tens of thousands of American family farms, he had a difficult meeting with Clyde Abernethy at Boone County National Bank and restructured a significant portion of his operating debt. He sold 400 of his 2,000 acres. In 1989, Gerald Whitmore planted his first cover crop, cereal rye, 600 acres. He planted it on the advice of a University of Missouri extension agent who had 3 years earlier walked Dale Krug's fields. He and Dale Krug were not friends. They were never friends exactly. But the county is small and men grow older, and in 1991, Gerald Whitmore stopped by Dale's farm on a May afternoon and stood at the edge of the north field, the field that Pfeiffer had knelt in, the field that had absorbed the August rain, and watched Dale's son-in-law run a planter through it. Gerald put his hands in his pockets and said, without making a production of it, "You were ahead of it, Dale." Dale Krug looked at the field. "The soil was ahead of it," he said. "I just listened." Ruth Ann Krug, who was 72 years old by then and had been bringing iced tea to whatever conversation happened to be occurring in her yard for 40-some years, brought iced tea and said nothing. She had heard her husband say similar things before. She had watched him say them in rooms where nobody listened and in fields where nobody came to see. She knew what she thought, and she kept it to herself with a dignity that was, in its way, its own kind of eloquence. Dale Krug kept farming until 1997, when he was 75 years old and finally, reluctantly, transferred the operation to his daughter Patricia and her husband, Jim Bohel, who had farmed alongside him since 1981. When Patricia and Jim took over the north field in the spring of 1997, they measured the topsoil. 14 years after Dale had stopped the bleeding, 14 years of cover crops and shallow tillage and careful stewardship, the topsoil in that field was back to 16 inches. 2 inches in 14 years, of soil that had taken 1,000 years to form. It doesn't sound like much. It was everything. Dale Emmett Krug died in January of 2003 at the age of 80, in the farmhouse on Route C where he had lived for most of his adult life. Ruth Ann had died 3 years before. Among the things left in his study were 44 composition notebooks, organized by year beginning in 1951. His last earthworm count was recorded in October of 2001. The count for his north field that year was 43 earthworms per 12-inch sample. His father had told him when Dale was 9 years old that healthy Missouri prairie soil should have 30 to 50 earthworms per 12-inch sample. Dale Krug died with his soil exactly where it should be. Let me pause here at the end of this story and ask you something. What do we do with knowledge when the world isn't ready for it? What do we do when we can see something clearly, when the evidence is in our hands, literally in our hands, and the room around us is too busy, too loud, too invested in a different answer to hear us? Dale Krug's answer was, you keep working, you don't wait for the room to come to you. You don't win arguments in Methodist church basements. You win them in the soil over years where the earthworms are either there or they're not, where the topsoil is either building or it's leaving, where the rain either soaks in or runs off. You win them in the long, quiet, accumulating arithmetic of care. There is a word that was not in common use in Audrain County, Missouri in 1983. The word is regenerative. We hear it constantly now: regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming, regenerative practices. It has become, like most good ideas that eventually make it to the mainstream, somewhat diluted by its own popularity. But the thing Dale Krug was doing in his north field in 1979, with his cereal rye and his rhizobium inoculation and his composition notebook and his earthworm counts, that was regenerative agriculture before anyone had put a name to it that anyone would use at a conference. He learned it from his father. His father learned it in part from necessity, from farming in the Dust Bowl shadow, and understanding that the land was not a resource to be extracted but a living system to be partnered with. Heinrich Krug had pressed Missouri soil to his nose in 1951 and said not enough life because he knew, without a degree in soil science, that living soil and dead soil were not the same thing, that the difference mattered. That no amount of chemistry would replace what biology does freely when you let it. This is not anti-science. I want to be clear about that because it's important. What Dale Krug was doing was not superstition or nostalgia. It was, in fact, more scientific than what Gerald Whitmore was doing because it accounted for systems that Whitmore's approach ignored. The science has caught up spectacularly in the decades since. We know now with rigorous certainty that soil biological communities are foundational to soil health. that mycorrhizal fungal networks transfer nutrients between plants, that earthworm activity can increase soil water infiltration by a factor of 10, that cover crops add organic matter and reduce erosion at rates that no synthetic input can match. The journals are full of it now. The universities teach it now. Dale Krug was teaching it in a Missouri field in 1979 with a composition notebook and a 12-inch square sample frame, because his father had looked at a handful of dirt in 1951 and said not enough life, and he had never stopped hearing it. Let me leave you with this. In an era of dramatic machinery and record yields, and chemical miracles and everything loud and impressive and expensive, in that era, a 61-year-old farmer in a Carhartt jacket was kneeling in his north field and counting earthworms. Not because it was profitable yet, not because anyone was watching, not because the extension office recommended it or the bank rewarded it. He was doing it because he understood that the debt you owe to the ground is not payable in inputs. It's payable in attention, in patience, in the kind of knowledge that takes 20 years to earn and can be written in a composition notebook and handed to a daughter who will hand it to her children. The lesson of Dale Krug's North Field is not complicated. It is listen to the soil before it stops talking. Historical context is real. The farm crisis of the 1980s, topsoil erosion data, USDA Soil Conservation Service activities, the Rodale Institute's work on regenerative agriculture, earthworm ecology research, and cover crop science are all documented and factual. Characters, names, dialogue, and specific events are dramatized for storytelling purposes.